I can't believe it, my son is playing. At the peak of his wealth, businessman Julian decides to hire a nanny for his child, who struggles with developmental issues. Although hesitant at first because she is black, he ultimately chooses Amelia for her experience. Using her skills, Amelia transforms the boy, who had become almost inseparably attached to his tablet, into a thoughtful, mature child far beyond his years in just 1 week. But will the millionaire show gratitude for this miracle, or will he let prejudice cloud his response? If you liked the video and have subscribed to my channel, let's move on to our story. Enjoy watching. Amelia's mornings were a quiet ritual of preparation, a methodical process she had honed over a decade of caring for the children of others. The sun, a lazy artist, was just beginning to paint the Manhattan skyline with streaks of gold and rose, but Amelia had been awake for hours. Her small, immaculate apartment, a third-floor walk-up in a brownstone in Harlem, was a sanctuary of organized calm. She moved with a practiced grace, her hands moving from the French press to a stack of meticulously organized binders, each one a testament to her career. These weren't just portfolios, they were chronicles of her work, filled with glowing testimonials, developmental milestones she had helped achieve, and her own comprehensive notes on child psychology and behavior. Today, however, the ritual felt less like a comfort and more like a crutch. A single heavy binder sat on the coffee table, a blank cover awaiting a new client's name. For 3 months, it had remained empty. A cold knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. It wasn't a lack of experience, certainly. Amelia was one of the most sought-after professional caregivers in the city, her expertise in early childhood development bordering on genius. She was known for her ability to connect with children on a profound level, to coax out their potential and build their confidence, even in cases where others had failed. Her last client, the spirited and initially withdrawn daughter of a media mogul, had blossomed under her care, now excelling in social situations and even showing an early aptitude for coding. Her success, however, did not insulate her from the shifting whims of the industry. The calls had been coming less frequently, the interviews less promising. The subtle, unspoken rejections stung more than the outright ones. She had heard a litany of excuses: "We've decided to go in a different direction," or "the timing just isn't right." She had seen the flicker of hesitation in prospective parents' eyes, a brief, imperceptible pause when they saw her, and she knew the conversation wasn't about her qualifications anymore. It was a familiar, systemic hurdle she had learned to navigate, but it never stopped being exhausting. She picked up her phone, scrolling through her calendar. A meeting with a potential client had been canceled yesterday, the 5th cancellation this month. She felt a familiar weight settle on her shoulders, the silent pressure of a mortgage, the rising cost of her mother's medication, and the ever-present need to not just survive but to thrive. She needed a job, a stable, long-term position. This wasn't just a career, it was her life, her purpose, and the foundation of her family's security. As she sipped her coffee, she reflected on a recent interaction with a friend, a fellow caregiver named Sarah. Sarah had confided her own struggles, the casual dismissal from a wealthy family who claimed they just didn't feel a connection. The family had ended up hiring a younger, less experienced woman who, to their friends' dismay, lacked a formal background in child development. They wanted a nanny, not a professional, Sarah had said with a sigh. And they wanted someone who looked like them too. The truth of the statement hung between them, a silent understanding of the invisible walls that still existed, even in the most progressive-seeming spaces. The truth was, Amelia didn't just watch children, she nurtured them. She crafted personalized curricula centered on play and discovery, integrating everything from foundational math skills to emotional regulation exercises into their daily routine. She wasn't just there to keep them safe, she was there to help them become their best selves. But that was a hard sell to people who were looking for a seamless extension of their own perfect, curated lives. They didn't want to be challenged. They didn't want to be made aware of their own shortcomings. A notification on her laptop startled her out of her reverie. It was an email from the Highbridge Agency, a prestigious, old-money firm that she had a long-standing relationship with. She held her breath as she clicked on it. It was a request for an interview. The details were sparse, a standard template. The client's name was redacted, but the description of the child was oddly specific. The boy was 7 years old, academically advanced but socially and emotionally underdeveloped. The family was seeking a caregiver with a proven track record of fostering emotional intelligence and social skills. The last line of the email caught her eye. The client is aware of and has specifically requested your specialized expertise. The words were a balm to her weary spirit. It was the first time in months that a potential client hadn't immediately rejected her for superficial reasons. The Highbridge agency was known for discretion, and this kind of targeted request was rare. It meant someone, somewhere, had done their research. They weren't looking for a pretty face or a simple babysitter. They were looking for a solution, and they believed she was it. She felt a slow, hopeful warmth spread through her chest. The knot of anxiety loosened its grip. This wasn't just another application. It was a chance to prove herself not just to a new client, but to herself, to the industry, and to the quiet doubts that had been whispering in her ear. She would prepare with the same intensity she always did, meticulously, thoughtfully. The empty binder no longer felt like a symbol of stagnation. It felt like a promise. It felt like the beginning. She closed the laptop and walked to her window, looking out at the city. The sun had crested the skyscrapers now, bathing the world in a bright, unforgiving light. The struggle was real, but so was her resolve. This new opportunity was a crack in a seemingly impenetrable wall, and she was going to get through it. She knew what she was worth and she knew what she could do. Now she just had to convince one more person to see it too. Julian's world was a fortress of glass and steel, a testament to a life built on precision and profit. His penthouse, a minimalist masterpiece perched atop a spire of polished chrome, offered a panoramic view of the city he had so meticulously conquered. He could see the intricate network of streets below, the pulsing arteries of a metropolis he believed he understood better than anyone. Yet, within the sterile perfection of his home, a single critical metric was failing. His son. 7-year-old Ethan was a ghost in his own home. He moved silently through the vast, open-plan spaces, his face a passive mask, his eyes perpetually fixed on a screen. Julian had provided him with every conceivable advantage: the best private schools, tutors in every subject from Mandarin to chess, and a playroom filled with state-of-the-art educational toys. But none of it seemed to resonate. There were no outbursts of joy, no inquisitive questions, no moments of childish rebellion that Julian could interpret as a healthy sign of development. Just a quiet, unnerving compliance. Julian viewed his son's lack of engagement not as a character trait, but as a business problem, an optimization challenge. He had hired a series of caregivers, all of whom had come highly recommended from his exclusive network. Each one had been a failure in his eyes, a variable that didn't produce the desired outcome. He saw them as he saw most things, a means to an end. But the end never came. The reports from the tutors were always the same. Ethan was a brilliant mind, but one that seemed trapped in a shell. He could solve complex problems, but he showed no curiosity. He could read at a high level, but he never seemed to engage with a story. The breaking point arrived at a charity gala, a predictable affair of gilded platitudes and power brokering. Julian's rival, a tech magnate named Marcus Thorne, cornered him by the bar. "My son just got accepted into the junior robotics program at MIT, Thorne boasted, his smile a little too wide. "He's building a drone that can navigate autonomously. Brilliant kid. It's a real joy to see." The words, meant to be a show of friendly rivalry, felt like a direct hit. Julian mumbled a hollow congratulations, his mind already racing. He had been so focused on building his empire that he had overlooked the most important project of all. He had to fix this. Back in his silent fortress, Julian spent the next 2 days in a furious, methodical search. He dismissed his current nanny, a pleasant but ineffective woman who had confessed to him that she found Ethan a bit quiet. Quiet. The word felt like a death sentence. Julian needed more than quiet. He needed potential. He reached out to a private, boutique agency known for their discretion and unparalleled access to top-tier talent. He laid out his demands: a caregiver with a proven track record, a professional who could deliver tangible, measurable results. He didn't want someone who would simply occupy his son. He wanted someone who would unlock him. The agency sent him a short list of candidates, a meticulously crafted dossier of accomplishments. The profiles were impressive, filled with Ivy League degrees and glowing recommendations from equally wealthy and influential families. But one profile stood out, not for its similarities to the others but for its difference. The candidate was Amelia Carter. Her resume was a staggering list of achievements. A degree in early childhood education, specialized training in behavioral therapy, and a list of success stories that read like a fairy tale. One child, described as unreachable, was now a budding concert pianist. Another, socially anxious, was now a peer mentor at her school. Julian read the testimonials, his mind calculating. The data was irrefutable. But then he looked at the photograph. A wave of unease, a flicker of something he chose not to name, washed over him. The photograph showed a kind but resolute face. A black woman in her late 40s. It wasn't what he expected. It wasn't what his friends or his colleagues would expect. He was a man of logic and data, and yet, a primal, unacknowledged prejudice surfaced. A whisper of a stereotype he had been taught to ignore but had never truly shed. He felt a moment of conflict. He could dismiss her just like that. But the data. The agency's note was even more compelling. Miss Carter is known for her unparalleled ability to connect with children who resist traditional methods. The word resist hit him hard. That was exactly what Ethan was doing. Julian was a man who trusted numbers above all else, and Amelia's numbers were flawless. He made a decision, a leap of faith grounded in the cold, hard facts of her resume. He would hire her. He would give her a chance to prove her expertise. He would place his son in her care and wait to see if, for once, the metrics would finally change. The doorman at the base of Julian's building was an imposing figure in a crisp uniform, a living monument to the exclusivity of the address. He took one look at Amelia, her neatly tailored navy suit and the professional dignity she carried, and nodded, confirming her appointment without a word. Amelia felt a familiar flicker of pride. She had dressed for success, not for the impression she hoped to make, but because her work demanded a level of decorum and seriousness. The elevator ride was silent, a vertical journey through a world she had only ever observed from a distance. With each floor, the air grew colder, more insulated from the city's chaotic hum. When the doors finally opened, she stepped into a world of curated silence. The penthouse was less a home and more a gallery. Walls of glass framed a breathtaking panorama, but the view felt sterile, devoid of the vibrant life of the city below. The furniture was all sharp angles and muted tones, each piece placed with a mathematical precision that spoke to a life lived by design, not by instinct. In the center of the vast, open-plan living area, a man sat at a sleek, minimalist desk. Julian. He was as she had pictured him from the brief agency profile, a study in power and control. His suit was immaculately cut, and his face, handsome but taut, was illuminated by the glow of 3 different monitors. He did not stand to greet her. He simply gestured to the leather chair opposite him, his eyes never leaving the screen. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice a low, modulated hum. "Please have a seat." The words were an order, not an invitation. Amelia sat, placing her leather-bound portfolio on the glass tabletop. Julian finally looked up, his gaze sweeping over her face and her file with the detached scrutiny of a man inspecting an investment. The flicker of unease she had anticipated was there, a fleeting shadow in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by the cold, calculating focus she had seen in the faces of countless clients. "Your credentials are impeccable," he stated, the pause before the last word a subtle signal of his surprise. "The agency speaks very highly of your work with children who have unique needs." He was using the jargon of his world, a sanitized, corporate language that stripped the human element from the situation. Julian slid a copy of her contract and a non-disclosure agreement across the table. "The terms are standard. We've included a clause for a performance-based bonus. If you can show a significant improvement in Ethan's social and emotional development within 3 months, the compensation will be adjusted accordingly." Amelia's spine straightened. "Mr. Thorne, my work is not a science experiment with a predictable outcome," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It is a process that requires patience and trust." Julian's brow furrowed slightly, a sign she had breached his protocol. "My methodology is holistic. I can't guarantee a specific timeline for results, as every child is different. But I can guarantee my complete dedication and expertise." He tapped a pen on the desk, a rhythmic click-click-click that felt like an impatient metronome. "I'm a man who believes in data, Miss Carter. Your resume is the data. I'm hiring you to prove it's valid." He didn't say it, but the unspoken message was clear: "Don't disappoint me." He was already back to his screens as if the conversation was an item on a checklist, now completed. Just then, a small shuffling sound from the hallway drew their attention. A boy, his small frame dwarfed by the immense hallway, emerged. He was hunched over a tablet, his thin shoulders curved forward, his face a pale oval in the dim light. He wore a simple gray t-shirt and jeans, a stark contrast to the opulence of his surroundings. This was Ethan. Amelia's gaze softened instantly, her analytical mind shifting from Julian's coldness to the boy's quiet withdrawal. He didn't look up, didn't acknowledge their presence. He simply continued his slow, aimless walk toward a sofa in the corner of the room, where he collapsed into a silent heap, his eyes fixed on the glowing screen. "Ethan, this is Amelia," Julian said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "She'll be looking after you for a while." Ethan's only response was an almost imperceptible twitch of his shoulders. Julian sighed, a sound of profound frustration. "He's been like this for months. We've tried everything. Tutors, specialists, even therapists. Nothing seems to work." The words were a bitter admission of defeat, a man of power admitting to his helplessness. Julian stood abruptly, gathering a briefcase from the floor beside his desk. "I'll be out of the country for a week. The housekeeper, Elena, will be here during the day. She'll show you around and take care of the household matters. You have the access codes to the building and the apartment. All the information you need is in the file. I have to go." He didn't say goodbye. He simply walked out, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space, a swift and final departure. One moment he was there, a pillar of corporate authority, and the next he was gone, leaving a silence more profound than before. Amelia was left alone with the boy and the hum of a ventilation system. The contrast between Julian's cold, impersonal departure and the profound human task before her was staggering. Julian had left his son as if he were leaving a package at the post office, a duty checked off a list. Amelia's professional instincts kicked in, overriding the emotional strangeness of the situation. She had no time for judgment, she had a child to connect with. She rose from the chair and quietly walked over to the sofa, her steps making no sound on the polished floors. She didn't sit directly next to him. Instead, she chose a spot on the floor a few feet away, a non-threatening distance. She didn't speak. She didn't even try to look at what was on the screen. She simply watched him, her gaze gentle, observant. She saw the way his fingers, thin and pale, moved with a frantic speed she recognized from other children with too much screen time. She saw the subtle tension in his jaw and the way his knees were drawn up, a small shield against the world. He was not just withdrawn, he was protecting himself. Finally, she opened her portfolio and took out a small, worn leather-bound book. It was not a toy. It was her own personal journal of exercises and stories she had created over the years. She didn't announce what she was doing. She simply sat there, tracing the lines of the simple sketches in her book, humming a soft, wordless tune. She was creating a bubble of safe, nonverbal presence. She was not a threat. She was not a new adult to be ignored, another face to be tuned out. She was simply there. After a few minutes, she spoke, her voice a low, melodic murmur. She didn't address him by name or ask a question. "The sun is so bright today," she said as if to herself. "It almost makes you want to close your eyes and just listen to the sound of the silence." She saw it then, a tiny, almost imperceptible shift. His thumb, which had been tapping relentlessly on the screen, stilled for a brief, fleeting moment. It was a minuscule victory, but it was a beginning. The calculus of care she knew was not about grand gestures. It was about these small, quiet connections. It was about trust, and it began with a single, unhurried moment of peace. The penthouse, once a tomb of curated silence, now carried a faint, almost imperceptible hum of life. It wasn't the boisterous laughter or the thundering footsteps of a typical child's playtime, but something more subtle. It was the soft clatter of wooden blocks, the rustle of paper, and the low melodic murmur of Amelia's voice. In the week since Julian's departure, a new rhythm had taken root. Julian was a man of schedules and spreadsheets, but Amelia's approach was a fluid, adaptive choreography of discovery. Her first few days with Ethan had been a test of her patience and resolve. He had remained a creature of habit, his world confined to the glowing rectangle of his tablet. He ate, slept, and moved through the vast apartment with the tablet as his constant companion, his body language a silent, unbreachable wall. Amelia had never once tried to pry it from his hands. Instead, she had sat with him, observing, noting the patterns of his digital world. She saw him navigating complex, architectural-style games, constructing elaborate, if impersonal, structures. He wasn't playing, he was calculating. On the third day she tried a different approach. She brought out a large, heavy box of magnetiles, their translucent, colored edges promising a world of possibility. She didn't say a word. She simply began building a tower on the floor, her movements slow and deliberate. She built it high, then knocked it down with a gentle, theatrical sweep of her hand. She started over, this time constructing a fortress with a small, makeshift drawbridge. She hummed a wordless tune, her presence an invitation, not a demand. At first, Ethan ignored her, but out of the corner of her eye, Amelia noticed a subtle shift. His head tilted slightly, a quick, almost imperceptible glance in her direction. It was a crack in the wall and she didn't push it. The next day she expanded her repertoire. She placed a set of large, interlocking wooden blocks on the floor and began to construct a city. This time, she narrated her actions, her voice soft as if she were talking to herself. "And here is the park where the little bears go to play," she would say, placing a block with a smooth, rounded edge. "And this is the tallest building where the brave firemen live." She wasn't asking for his participation, but she was creating a world he could enter. The hours passed in this manner, Amelia's quiet, creative presence a stark contrast to the sterile perfection of the penthouse. Ethan's first real engagement came on the 5th day. He had finished a level on his game and for the first time, did not immediately start a new one. His gaze lingered on a small red block Amelia had just placed. He was watching her. She didn't acknowledge it. She simply picked up a yellow block and, with a gentle, guiding motion, placed it next to the red one. She was building a miniature train. She looked at the blocks, then looked at a few other blocks in a deliberate pause as if inviting him. He took his thumb off the screen, his hand reaching out slowly. He picked up a green block and placed it carefully behind the yellow and red ones. He didn't look at her. He didn't make a sound. But he had joined her world. The housekeeper, Elena, a woman who had seen the parade of nannies come and go, watched with a quiet, observant wonder. She had initially been skeptical of Amelia, as she was of anyone who tried to insert themselves into the boy's impenetrable life. But as the days passed, she noticed the changes. The house no longer felt so empty. There was the rustle of activity, the sound of blocks falling, and once she swore she heard the soft, almost silent giggle of a child. One afternoon she brought Amelia a cup of tea. "He's different with you," she whispered, her voice a mix of awe and relief. "The others, they tried to get him to talk. To read. You just let him be." Amelia smiled, a deep, knowing warmth in her eyes. "He's not broken, Elena," she said softly. "He's just waiting for someone to speak his language." And Amelia's language was one of action and subtle, nonverbal cues. She introduced him to finger painting with edible paints, building elaborate pillow forts, and even, one rainy afternoon, creating a drum kit out of old pots and pans from the kitchen. With each activity she looked for the small, incremental changes, the subtle shifts in his behavior that spoke volumes. The first time he made direct eye contact with her was over a game of building a Lego rocket. He looked up, his pale blue eyes, which had always seemed so vacant, now held a spark of focused intensity. He didn't speak, but he looked at her, and in that gaze Amelia saw a question. What comes next? The true breakthrough came at the end of the second week. Amelia had been teaching Ethan how to make simple stop-motion animations using a small digital camera and a collection of his toy action figures. They had spent days arranging the figures in a meticulous sequence, moving them an inch at a time, capturing each frame. It was a tedious, patient process that required a level of focus and sustained engagement that Ethan had never previously demonstrated. They were working on a scene where a small knight was supposed to rescue a dragon from a tall tower. Ethan, hunched over the camera, suddenly stopped. He looked at the knight, then at the dragon, and finally he looked at Amelia. He wants to be friends," Ethan said, his voice a small rusty thing that sounded as if it hadn't been used in years. It was just 3 words, but they were a universe. Amelia felt a surge of emotion, a wave of triumph and relief. It wasn't just that he had spoken. It was that he had articulated a complex social concept, a narrative that he had created himself. He wasn't just building, he was storytelling. Amelia felt her eyes well up. She knelt down beside him. "He does," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "And they're going to have so many adventures together." He looked at her then, a small, tentative smile gracing his lips. It was a fleeting expression, a ghost of an emotion, but it was there. It was genuine. It was a sign that the wall was not just cracked, it was beginning to crumble. Julian, miles away, would have no way of knowing what had transpired in his sterile, silent home. He had received the standard, pre-formatted reports from his agency, the ones that simply stated the caregiver was on track. But what Julian didn't know, what he couldn't measure on any of his spreadsheets, was the unwritten language of care, the currency of connection that Amelia was spending so freely. And it was about to pay a dividend he never could have anticipated. The keycard slid into the slot with a quiet, efficient click, and the heavy door to Julian's penthouse swung open. He stepped inside, expecting the familiar, hushed atmosphere of his carefully curated home, a stillness as absolute as a vacuum. Julian had been gone for 10 days, a whirlwind of high-stakes negotiations in Tokyo and Frankfurt, and his mind was still operating on the hard-edged logic of a boardroom. He was prepared for a report from the housekeeper, a quick briefing on his son's uneventful week, and then the blessed silence that allowed him to decompress. But this time the silence was different. It wasn't the empty stillness he was accustomed to. It was the absence of a hum he hadn't known was missing, the faint, monotonous glow of a tablet screen. In the center of the vast living area, where Ethan would typically be a small, sedentary figure, there was only a scattering of what Julian's mind could only classify as unauthorized clutter. A sprawling, intricate structure of wooden blocks snaked across the polished floor, a miniature city with improbable bridges and towers. A splash of bright, vibrant color on a large sheet of paper, a painting of what looked like an abstract, multi-eyed monster, was laid out to dry on a side table. Julian's body went taut. He felt a flash of irritation, a primal response to something he had not approved or anticipated. He had a meticulous system for everything, and this was a disruption of that system. He took off his coat and briefcase, placing them with rigid precision on the hallway table. He was about to summon the housekeeper, Elena, to demand an explanation for this mess when a sound, soft and melodic, drifted from the direction of Ethan's bedroom. It was a child humming. A child's voice, low and tuneful. Julian stood still, paralyzed by the sound, a foreign object in his own home. He walked cautiously down the long hallway, the sound growing clearer with each step. It wasn't the sound of an audiobook or a song from a pre-programmed playlist. It was a spontaneous, wordless melody. He stopped just short of the open doorway, peering inside. What he saw was a scene so far removed from his expectations that for a moment, he thought he had entered the wrong apartment. Ethan was on his knees, not hunched over a screen, but completely absorbed in a miniature world he was creating. A small, vibrant train set was spread across the rug, its tracks winding through tiny forested hills made of crumpled brown paper and cotton ball snow. He was carefully placing a miniature plastic hiker on a hill, his brow furrowed in concentration. Amelia was beside him, not directing but participating. She was building a small hut out of popsicle sticks and clay, her hands moving with a fluid, easy grace. She hummed the same melody that Julian had heard from the hallway, a soft tune that seemed to be an unspoken conversation between them. The shock was profound. It wasn't just that Ethan was engaged in play, it was that he was alive. His face, which had been so pallid and blank for as long as Julian could remember, was now animated. His cheeks were flushed with a healthy color, and his eyes, those vacant blue pools, were alight with a focused, vivid light. He was talking too. Julian strained to hear the words. "The hiker," Ethan murmured, his voice still small and a little raspy. "He needs a fire, for the night." Julian felt his breath catch in his throat. He had not heard his son speak more than 3 words at a time in a year. Amelia's response was a revelation. She didn't offer to build the fire for him. She simply looked at him, her gaze gentle and encouraging. "And what does he need to build the fire, little hiker?" she asked, her voice a soft, low invitation. Ethan thought for a moment, then pointed to a few small twigs he had collected from a potted plant. He picked them up, his fingers moving with a newfound confidence, and placed them carefully by the hiker. The two of them continued in this quiet, collaborative dance, their actions a language Julian did not understand. Julian watched from the doorway, a silent, unacknowledged ghost in his own home, He saw the way Amelia would lean in, not to command but to listen. He saw the patience in her movements, the way she would pause and wait for Ethan to make a choice, to take the lead. He was watching the undoing of all his rigid structures, the crumbling of his data-driven world. The nannies he had hired before had been highly professional, but they had all tried to fix Ethan, to force him into a mold. They had seen his silence as a problem to be solved, not a fortress to be understood. Julian's initial irritation faded, replaced by a deep, unsettling sense of shame. He saw now that he had viewed his son as a project, a problem to be solved. He had handed over the responsibility, then walked away, assuming that money could purchase a solution. But what he was witnessing was not a transaction. It was a relationship. It was care. It was patience. It was a slow, meticulous process that required a level of human connection he had been incapable of providing. He saw Amelia's kind, patient face and remembered his initial, unspoken prejudice, the flicker of doubt he had felt when he first saw her photograph. He had judged her, dismissed her, and yet she was the one who was doing what all his wealth and power could not. She was reaching his son. He backed away from the doorway as silently as he had come, his heart a raw, unshielded thing in his chest. He didn't want to disturb them. He felt like an intruder in the one place he should have belonged. He returned to the living room, the city of wooden blocks now looking less like a mess and more like a work of art. The colorful painting, no longer just a splash of color, felt like a window into a world of imagination he had never known his son possessed. Julian sat in his chair, the glow of his monitors off for the first time in weeks. He was no longer a man of logic and data. He was a man with a raw, unshakable feeling in his gut. A feeling of profound gratitude and an equally profound sense of regret. Julian's business meetings, once a source of invigorating challenge, now felt like a monotonous drone. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the silent scene from his apartment, the impromptu block city, the vibrant drawing and the small melodic hum of his son. The numbers on the spreadsheets, the market fluctuations, the intricate dance of corporate mergers, it all seemed hollow in the face of the unquantifiable change he had witnessed in Ethan. He had to know. He had to understand the mechanics of this transformation, not with the cold logic of an analyst, but with the raw, desperate curiosity of a father. He left his office at 3 in the afternoon, abandoning a pivotal strategy session without a word, a move so uncharacteristic it sent his assistant into a state of panic. He didn't announce his arrival. He used the private elevator that opened directly into his penthouse and slipped inside with the quiet stealth of a burglar. The doorman, accustomed to his employer's rigid schedule, didn't even register his early return. The silence was different this time. It was a living, breathing silence. It was filled with a subtle energy that Julian now recognized as the absence of a barrier. He followed the sound of a voice, not Amelia's this time, but Ethan's. It was a high-pitched, enthusiastic chatter, followed by a deeper, calmer response. Julian crept down the hallway, stopping just shy of the living room entrance, concealing himself behind a towering bookshelf. The sight that greeted him was a complete dismantling of his world. Ethan was sitting cross-legged on the floor, his face a canvas of pure, unadulterated joy. He was not just playing, he was engaged in an elaborate drama. In front of him, a magnificent city made of cushions, blankets, and chairs rose from the floor. He was holding a small toy car, making a series of zooming noises as he navigated its makeshift streets. Amelia was not a participant, but a partner. She was on the other side of the city, holding a large flashlight, her face illuminated by the beam. "There's a fire, Captain Max," Ethan exclaimed, his voice clear and resonant. "The city needs help." Amelia held the flashlight steady, her eyes locked on Ethan's. "It's very dark, Captain Max. Can you tell me what's in your way?" she asked, her voice a low, encouraging murmur. Ethan paused, his eyes scanning the pillow fortress. There's a big mountain of blankets here," he said, pointing with a confident finger. "And a river of pillows." "A river of pillows?" Amelia repeated, a smile playing on her lips. "What's the best way to get across?" Julian watched, mesmerized. This was not a child who was being led. This was a child who was being taught to lead himself. Amelia wasn't giving him the answers, she was giving him the tools to find them. Julian saw the subtle nod of encouragement she gave him after each question, the quiet, patient way she waited for his response. This was the expertise she had spoken of, but it was nothing like he had imagined. It wasn't about standardized tests or rote memorization. It was about building a sense of self-agency and confidence, one pillow mountain at a time. The sight of his son's bright, engaged eyes was a revelation, a mirror reflecting Julian's own profound isolation and fear. He had been so afraid of his son's silence, so convinced it was a sign of brokenness, that he had never once considered it was a silent plea for connection. A sudden flash of memory hit Julian with the force of a physical blow. A fleeting, half-forgotten image of Julian as a small boy, sitting in a stark, silent room, his own father absent, his mind a whirlwind of unspoken questions. He had been taught to view emotions as liabilities and vulnerabilities as weaknesses. He had been trained to be a CEO, not a person. He saw now that he had inflicted the same silent prison on his son. He wasn't broken. He was just a reflection of his father's own emotional void. Unable to contain himself any longer, Julian stepped out from behind the bookshelf. His sudden appearance caused Ethan to freeze, his hand gripping the toy car, his face instantly reverting to its familiar, guarded blankness. A flicker of disappointment crossed Julian's face. He had broken the spell. Amelia, however, did not flinch. She simply looked up, her expression calm, her gaze steady and unwavering. Julian walked towards them, his movements clumsy and unpracticed in this new world. He knelt down on the floor, a suit-clad giant in a world of pillows and toys. He looked at Ethan, whose eyes were fixed on the floor. "Ethan," Julian said, his voice raw with emotion. I'm sorry." The words felt foreign on his tongue, a language he hadn't spoken since childhood. I didn't see you." Ethan slowly looked up, his pale blue eyes questioning, but without the usual fear. He looked at his father, then at Amelia, a small, silent question passing between them. Amelia gave a subtle nod, a quiet reassurance that it was safe to respond. Ethan's small voice was barely a whisper. "It's a city for heroes." Julian felt a powerful wave of emotion. He reached out and gently took one of the toy cars. "It's the most magnificent city I've ever seen," he said, his voice thick with unspent tears. He looked at Amelia. "How?" he asked, the single word a question that encompassed a lifetime of ignorance and a week of profound revelation. Amelia's response was gentle and direct. "You didn't need to fix him, Mr. Thorne. You just needed to see him. And he needed someone to speak his language. It wasn't a digital language, it was a language of imagination and trust." Julian's eyes welled up. He was no longer the imposing CEO. He was a man humbled by a truth he had never dared to face. He saw not just a caregiver but an artist, a healer, a guide. He felt a deep sense of gratitude so profound it was almost painful. He looked at Amelia, this woman he had initially judged and underestimated, and saw in her eyes a quiet strength and a deep, compassionate understanding. She hadn't fixed his son, she had helped his son find himself. And in doing so, she had shown Julian the path to finding his own way back to a world he had long ago abandoned. The icy grip around his heart finally, mercifully began to melt. The morning after his profound realization, Julian Thorne felt like a man walking on unfamiliar ground. The meticulously organized world he had inhabited for decades, a world of calibrated risks and predictable outcomes, had been replaced by the chaotic, beautiful landscape of human connection. He sat at the breakfast table not with a tablet or a financial paper, but with Ethan and Amelia. He had no schedule. He had no agenda. For the first time he was simply present. Julian's initial attempts at engagement were clumsy. He tried to build a train track with Ethan, but his hands, so used to the precise movements of a keyboard, fumbled with the small pieces. He laid the tracks in perfectly straight, parallel lines, a reflection of his own rigid mind, but they led nowhere. Ethan, with a gentle, patient dexterity that Julian found humbling, took the curved pieces and began to construct a winding, looping track. Julian, instead of correcting him, simply watched, a silent student. Amelia observed Julian's awkwardness with a quiet kindness. She didn't intercede directly but offered gentle guidance. When Julian tried to ask Ethan what he wanted to do next, a question that hung in the air with the weight of a business query, Amelia subtly stepped in. "Ethan, your little engine has a long way to go to get to the station," she said, her voice a soft suggestion. "Maybe Mr. Thorne can build a bridge for it?" She wasn't just directing Ethan, she was giving Julian a role, a task he could understand and execute. It was a bridge not just for a toy train but for his own sense of helplessness. Julian, with renewed purpose, searched for the bridge pieces, his movements more fluid now that he had a clear objective. The days that followed were a series of small, incremental lessons. Amelia taught Julian to play with his eyes, not just his hands. She showed him how to notice the subtle shift in Ethan's expression when a new idea sparked in his mind, the way his fingers would drum with excitement before he spoke, the almost imperceptible movements that were the true language of his inner world. One afternoon, Julian found them in the sunroom, Amelia guiding Ethan's hand as he painted on a large canvas. Ethan was humming, a new tune Julian had never heard before, a bright and cheerful melody. He looked at the painting, a swirling mix of blues and yellows, and a thought, so simple it felt revolutionary, came to him. It wasn't about what the painting was but what it was for. It was an expression of joy. Julian knelt beside them, a fresh palette in his hand. He didn't try to create a masterpiece. He simply chose a dark shade of blue and began to fill in a small corner. He felt a childlike thrill as the colors spread across the canvas. He was no longer in control, he was a collaborator. Ethan noticed, his eyes widening. He dipped his brush into a bright shade of yellow and painted a small sun in the corner Julian had just filled. Julian looked at him, and for the first time Ethan gave him a small, genuine smile. It was a fleeting but perfect moment of connection, a silent agreement that they were creating something together. Julian felt a profound sense of peace. The raw ache in his heart was being replaced by a quiet, steady warmth. The most significant breakthrough came later that week. Amelia had been reading to Ethan from a children's book about a small badger who was afraid of the dark. Ethan had listened, as he always did, with his rapt attention, but Julian noticed a new element. He would lean in, his head tilted, his fingers tracing the images of the badger. When Amelia closed the book, Julian took a chance. "Ethan," he said, his voice soft, "what do you think the badger was really afraid of?" Julian expected silence, but Ethan's small voice was quick and clear. "He was afraid of being alone," Ethan said. He then looked at Julian and said, "Just like me." Julian's breath hitched. He wasn't a CEO. He was just a father. He wrapped his arms around Ethan, pulling him into a tight, secure hug. Ethan didn't flinch. He leaned into the embrace, his small body a warm, trusting weight. Julian held him, feeling the small, steady beat of his son's heart against his chest. He closed his eyes, a wellspring of emotion threatening to spill over. He had spent a lifetime building walls to protect himself, but here, in this moment, those walls had finally come down. He looked at Amelia over Ethan's shoulder. She was standing by the bookshelf, a gentle, knowing smile on her face. In her eyes he saw not pity or condescension, but a deep, shared sense of triumph. The following day Julian made a decision. He had a charity gala to attend that evening, a high-profile black-tie affair that was a cornerstone of his social calendar. Instead of getting ready, he pulled out a casual polo and jeans, clothes he hadn't worn in years. He went to the kitchen, where Amelia was preparing lunch, and spoke to her, not as an employer, but as an equal. "Amelia," he said, his voice hesitant but firm, "I'm taking Ethan out. To a park. I want you to come with us." Amelia's face registered surprise, followed by a radiant smile. "I'd love to," she said. The trio ventured out into the bustling city. Julian, holding Ethan's hand, walked with a confidence he hadn't felt in years. They found a small, secluded park and Julian pushed Ethan on a swing, the rhythmic squeak of the chains a perfect counterpoint to the rush of the city. He then saw Ethan run towards a playground and start to climb a small plastic ladder. Julian's heart felt like it would burst out of his chest, and for the first time in a decade he let go. He wasn't thinking about the next quarter, the next meeting, or the next acquisition. He was just watching his son, an unencumbered little boy, climb a ladder and reach the top. He felt the hot sting of tears in his eyes, but this time they were tears of pure joy. Amelia watched from a nearby bench, a look of profound satisfaction on her face. She had done her job. Not by training a child but by teaching a father to be a father. The money he paid her seemed a paltry sum compared to the gift she had given him. The gift of his son's childhood and the long-lost currency of his own heart. The transaction was complete, but the relationship had just begun. The weeks that followed Julian's early return to his penthouse were a blur of small, meaningful moments. The sterile, quiet apartment had been transformed into a living, breathing home. It was now filled with the cheerful clutter of a happy child, building blocks in the hallway, an easel with a half-finished painting in the sunroom, and a collection of toy cars that had migrated from the playroom to a new home on the dining room rug. Julian, the man who had once abhorred mess, now found a strange, deep satisfaction in it. The chaos was a testament to life. Julian had learned to see his son not as a project with a set of metrics to be met, but as a person with a world of emotions to be explored. He had traded his business suits for casual clothes and his high-stakes meetings for long afternoons at the park. He and Ethan had a new ritual. After a day of play, they would sit on the couch together and Julian would read to him. He found that his son's vocabulary had expanded exponentially, and he now asked a constant stream of questions. His curiosity of fire Julian had never known existed. Why does the sun go down, Daddy? Or, do fish get lonely? Julian, who had once had an answer for every question in a boardroom, now found himself without answers, and he had never been happier. Amelia was a quiet, constant presence in this new reality. She was a gentle guide, not a director. She would stand back, allowing Julian and Ethan to navigate their new bond, stepping in only when needed, a silent reassurance. One evening, after putting Ethan to bed, Julian found her in the kitchen, preparing tea. He hesitated at the doorway, suddenly feeling the weight of all the words he had been unable to say. "Amelia," he began, his voice low and unsure. I don't know how to thank you. You've done something for my son that I never could." Amelia turned, her hands still on the kettle. "I didn't do anything, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice soft. "I just helped him find his way back to himself. And in a way, I think I helped you find your way back too." Julian felt a powerful wave of emotion. The truth of her words was a raw, unshielded thing in his chest. He had hired her to fix his son, but she had mended a broken family. He had viewed her with suspicion and prejudice, and she had responded with patience and compassion. He looked at her, truly saw her, not as an employee but as a person of immense character and grace. "You're not an employee anymore, Amelia," Julian said, the words coming from a place of deep, unadulterated gratitude. "I want you to be a part of our family." Amelia's eyes, those warm, intelligent pools, welled up with tears. She had spent a lifetime proving her worth in a world that often saw her as an outsider. To be seen, to be accepted, and to be valued not for her services, but for her character, was a gift more precious than any monetary compensation. Over the next few months, their lives intertwined in ways Julian had never imagined. Amelia became a fixture in their home. They no longer had a rigid schedule. Instead, they had a rhythm. Julian would work from home more often, his office a place he visited only when necessary. His meetings were shorter, his decisions more thoughtful, his focus shifting from the bottom line to the fullness of his life. One day he found himself laughing, a deep, booming laugh that felt foreign and wonderful, as he and Ethan built a magnificent fortress out of sofa cushions. He looked over at Amelia, who was watching them with a radiant smile, her presence a silent reminder of the journey they had taken. Julian finally understood. The metrics of success he had lived by for so long were meaningless. True wealth wasn't measured in revenue or stock prices, but in the sound of his son's laughter, the warmth of his small hand in his, and the quiet, unwavering presence of a woman who had taught him how to love. One afternoon he walked into the living room and found Amelia and Ethan sitting on the floor, their heads bent over a large, beautiful scrapbook. It was filled with pictures of their adventures. The trips to the park, the museum visits, and the quiet afternoons spent building things in the sunroom. Julian looked at the images and felt a profound sense of peace. His life was not a project to be completed, but a story to be lived. And for the first time he was ready to start writing the next chapter. He sat down on the floor and pulled them both into a hug, a family finally and forever. Dear viewer, if you've watched up to this point, thank you for your support. I have a small request. If you enjoy my stories, you can subscribe to the channel, and don't hesitate to share your thoughts about the stories in the comments. Enjoy watching. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video.